What would you do if the life you built crumbled in an instant? Weston thought he had the perfect marriage, until a single text unraveled everything. Lies, betrayal, and devastating choices collide in a story that will leave you questioning trust, love, and the price of forgiveness. Are you ready for the truth? The warm glow of the lamp flickered across Weston Callahan's desk, casting long shadows on the walls of his small furniture showroom. The rhythmic tick of the clock marked the late hour, but Weston barely noticed. His hands brushed over a stack of invoices, yet his mind wandered elsewhere. Ellie's recent behavior gnawed at him like a splinter buried deep, invisible but impossible to ignore. That evening her laughter had lingered in his ears. Not the laughter he remembered from their early days, full of light and affection, but something sharper, foreign. She had been on the phone, her back turned, a quiet giggle escaping her lips. When he entered the room, her voice dropped to a whisper, and she ended the call abruptly. "It's just work," she had said, brushing him off with a wave. Yet the unease in her eyes betrayed her. The vibration of his own phone pulled him from his thoughts. A text notification flashed on the screen. "I miss you. Same place tomorrow?" Weston's brows furrowed as he read the message again. It wasn't meant for him. His pulse quickened as he scanned the sender, an unknown number. His stomach churned. Ellie's phone had been sitting on the kitchen counter earlier. Had she forgotten to sign out of her account? Standing abruptly, he grabbed his jacket and headed home, his mind racing with possibilities. The night air was crisp, the kind that seeped into your bones and lingered. His truck rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the darkness as he replayed every moment from the past month. The long work nights, the sudden interest in new clothes, her hesitance to share her schedule. When Weston arrived home, the house was silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. Ellie's phone still sat on the counter where she had left it, the screen dark. He hesitated, fingers hovering just above it. He hated this, hated what it said about him, about them. But the knot in his chest tightened, and he knew he wouldn't sleep without answers. Unlocking her phone felt like stepping over a line he couldn't return from. The screen blinked to life, revealing a series of texts from an unknown contact. "Last night was incredible. Same time tomorrow? Miss you already." Weston's chest tightened as he scrolled further, each message unraveling another thread of the life he thought they shared. He set the phone down carefully, his fingers trembling. A memory surged forward, unbidden, a warm spring day when he had proposed to Ellie on the ridge overlooking their town. Her laugh had been light then, genuine. She had said yes before he could even finish the question. That moment felt like another lifetime now. The sound of Ellie's keys jingling in the door snapped him back. He straightened, sliding the phone back into its place as she entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hey," she said, her voice chipper, her smile automatic. But Weston's eyes lingered a moment too long on the slight smudge of lipstick on her collar, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne hanging in the air. "Late night?" he asked, his voice steady, betraying nothing of the storm raging within. "Staff meeting ran over," she replied quickly, too quickly. She busied herself with the mail on the counter, avoiding his gaze. Weston nodded, forcing a tight smile. "You must be exhausted." "Completely," she replied, but her hands fumbled as she sifted through the envelopes. Weston noted the way her shoulders tensed, her fingers twitching like they were searching for an escape. As she moved to the living room, Weston lingered in the kitchen, his jaw tightening. The unknown number flashed in his mind, the messages burning behind his eyes. He poured himself a glass of water, his grip firm on the glass as if anchoring himself to something tangible. He wouldn't confront her tonight. Not yet. Not until he knew everything. The clock struck midnight as Weston sat in the dark, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his chest. For the first time in their 15 years together, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The cracks in their foundation were no longer small, they were gaping wounds, and he couldn't unsee them. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting soft golden hues across the countertops. Weston sat at the table, his coffee untouched, staring at the steam rising in lazy swirls. Ellie moved about the kitchen, her back turned to him as she buttered toast. Her movements seemed normal, casual even, But Weston's eyes lingered on her longer than usual, searching for cracks in her carefully crafted facade. "You're quiet this morning," Ellie said, glancing over her shoulder with a slight smile. Her voice carried its usual warmth, but to Weston it felt forced, an act. "Just tired," he replied, his voice steady. The messages from the previous night replayed in his mind, each word digging deeper into his chest. He had barely slept, wrestling with the weight of his discovery. Ellie nodded, placing a plate of toast in front of him. "Busy day at work?" she asked, sitting across from him. Her tone was casual, but Weston noticed the faint tension in her posture, the way her hands fiddled with the edge of her mug, her eyes darting away from his. "Yeah," he said simply, not offering more. Silence settled between them, heavy and loaded. As she rose to grab her bag, her phone buzzed on the counter. Weston's eyes flicked to it instinctively. The name Patrick M. flashed across the screen, accompanied by a text. "Can't stop thinking about last night." Weston's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Ellie quickly snatched up the phone, her fingers fumbling as she swiped the screen and stuffed it into her bag. "I'm running late," she said hurriedly, avoiding his gaze. "I'll see you tonight." Weston nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Have a good day." His voice was calm, but inside, a storm raged. As the door closed behind her, Weston exhaled sharply, his fists clenching. The confirmation was undeniable now. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was real. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty chair across from him, before pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over Grace Monroe's contact. She had always been a steady presence in their lives, a friend and confidant. But calling her felt like crossing another line. After a deep breath, he dialed. "Weston," Grace's familiar voice greeted him warmly. "What a surprise. Everything all right?" "Grace," Weston began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. What's going on?" Weston hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he said, "Have you noticed anything strange about Ellie lately?" Grace was silent for a moment, and Weston could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. "Weston," she said carefully, "I don't want to make any assumptions, but I've seen her meeting someone, a man. It could be nothing, but—" "It's not nothing," Weston cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. "I need to know who it is." There was another pause, heavier this time. "Patrick Monroe," Grace finally said, her voice soft. "He's a teacher at her school. I've seen them at the cafe downtown, more than once." The confirmation hit Weston like a blow, even though he already knew. Hearing it aloud made it real in a way the messages couldn't. "Thank you," he managed, his voice tight. "I needed to hear it from someone else." "I'm sorry, Weston," Grace said gently. "If there's anything I can do—" "No," he interrupted. "This is something I need to handle on my own." After ending the call, Weston leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Patrick Monroe. The name echoed in his mind, fueling the anger simmering just beneath the surface. This wasn't just about Ellie anymore. This was about the life they had built, the family they had created, and the lies that threatened to tear it apart. By the time Ellie returned home that evening, Weston had regained his composure. He greeted her with the same calm smile, the same steady voice, but his mind was already at work, piecing together his next move. If this storm was coming, he would be ready for it. Weston Callahan parked his truck across the street from the school, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as the bell rang in the distance. Children poured out into the afternoon sun, their laughter echoing across the parking lot. Weston's gaze wasn't on them. It was on the figure of Patrick Monroe, stepping out of the school doors with his usual air of confidence. Patrick laughed at something a colleague said, oblivious to Weston's piercing stare. Weston's jaw tightened. This was the man who had infiltrated his life, his family. A man who smiled like the world owed him everything, completely unaware, or uncaring, of the destruction he left in his wake. As Patrick made his way to his car, Weston snapped a picture with his phone. It wasn't much, but it was another piece of evidence. He had hired a private investigator earlier that morning, someone discreet and thorough, but Weston felt compelled to collect his own proof. He couldn't just sit idly by while his world crumbled. When Weston returned home, he found Charlotte in the living room, her books spread out across the coffee table. She glanced up, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, sweetheart," Weston replied, forcing a smile. "How's the homework?" "Fine," she said, her tone clipped. She hesitated, her pen hovering over the page, before blurting, "Is everything okay with you and Mom?" Weston froze, the question catching him off guard. "What makes you ask that?" Charlotte shrugged, her eyes dropping to her notebook. "You've both been weird lately. Mom's always out and you're quiet." Weston exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said gently. "Sometimes adults just go through things." Charlotte nodded, though the furrow in her brow remained. Weston hated the thought of her being dragged into this mess, but he couldn't lie to her, not completely. "If there's ever something you want to talk about," he added, "I'm here." "Okay," she murmured, but her focus had already shifted back to her books. Weston lingered for a moment, watching her before retreating to his office. The investigator's report arrived that evening. Weston sat alone at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the file. Photographs spilled out, each one a dagger to the heart. Ellie and Patrick at a cafe, their heads bent close together. Ellie brushing Patrick's arm, her face lit with laughter. And the final image, Ellie and Patrick entering a small inn just outside of town. Weston's chest tightened as he stared at the evidence. It was all there, laid out in black and white, and yet it didn't feel real. The woman in those photos didn't look like the Ellie he knew. She looked carefree, almost happy. His mind churned with questions. How long had this been going on? Had their entire marriage been a lie? And why Patrick? What did he have that Weston didn't? As the anger surged, so did a bitter resolve. He wouldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more. He needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal before he made his move. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control over his life. Ellie arrived home late that night, her footsteps hesitant as she entered the kitchen. Weston stayed in his office, the photos spread out before him like pieces of a shattered puzzle. He heard her pause outside the door, her hand resting on the knob for a moment before moving away. The soft creak of the stairs followed as she retreated to their bedroom. For a long time, Weston sat in the silence, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. Finally, he gathered the photos and slid them back into the envelope. He placed it in the drawer, locking it securely. The truth was out there now, no longer hidden in plain sight, but the battle had only just begun. Weston Callahan stood at the kitchen counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The envelope from the investigator lay in front of him, its edges worn from his restless handling. Each photo inside was a wound, and he felt them all anew each time he dared to look. Ellie descended the stairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She entered the room, her gaze flicking briefly to Weston before settling on the coffee machine. "Morning," she said lightly, as though the weight of their fractured marriage didn't hang in the air between them. "Morning," Weston replied, his tone neutral. He turned back to the counter, his fingers gripping the edge tighter than necessary. Ellie moved about the kitchen, her movements purposeful, but Weston could see the tension in her shoulders. She was trying too hard to appear normal. "I'll be working late again tonight," she said casually, her back still to him. "Another meeting?" Weston asked, the sharpness in his voice catching even him off guard. Ellie hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, parent-teacher conferences are coming up, so there's a lot to prepare." She turned to face him, her smile forced. "You know how it is?" Weston stared at her for a moment, his mind replaying the images of her and Patrick at the inn. "I'm sure it's a lot of work," he said finally, forcing his voice into something resembling calm. Her smile wavered, but she said nothing more. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, pausing only to call out, "See you tonight." The door clicked shut, and Weston let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The lie had rolled off her tongue so easily, so effortlessly, that it made his stomach churn. Later that day, Weston sat in his office at the furniture shop, the envelope open on his desk. He stared at the photos, his jaw clenched, the storm inside him building. The betrayal wasn't just in her actions, it was in the way she looked at Patrick, the way she laughed with him, as if Weston didn't exist. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Grace Monroe stepped in, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Weston," she said softly, "I need to talk to you." Weston gestured for her to sit, pushing the photos aside. "What is it, Grace?" She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about Ellie and Patrick." Her voice faltered on his name, but she pressed on. "There's something you need to know. Patrick, he's not who you think he is." Weston frowned. "What do you mean?" "Patrick has a history," Grace said carefully. "He's done this before. My daughter, his wife, left him for a reason. He's manipulative, Weston, dangerous even." Weston's fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing. "And Ellie? Did she know?" "I don't think so," Grace admitted. "But you need to be careful. He'll twist this to protect himself. He always does." The weight of her words settled heavily on Weston. Patrick wasn't just a man who had seduced his wife. He was a predator, a ticking time bomb. "Thank you, Grace," Weston said finally, his voice low, "for telling me." She nodded, her expression somber. "I just thought you should know what you're dealing with." After she left, Weston sat in the quiet, the storm inside him swirling faster. He had planned to wait, to gather more evidence, but now he wasn't so sure. Patrick wasn't just a threat to his marriage. He was a threat to Ellie, to their family, and Weston wasn't going to let him win. That evening, when Ellie returned home, Weston was waiting. He sat at the kitchen table, the envelope of photos placed deliberately in front of him. Ellie froze in the doorway, her eyes darting to the envelope and then to his face. "We need to talk," Weston said, his voice calm but unyielding. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the glow of Weston's laptop screen. His eyes scanned the emails he had meticulously gathered over the past few days, each line of text a confirmation of Ellie's betrayal. He clicked on another file, the pictures from the investigator, his jaw tightening as he studied the moments frozen in time. Ellie and Patrick at the cafe, Patrick's hand resting on her back as they entered the inn. Her smile, so familiar yet so distant, cut him deeper than any words could. Weston shut the laptop with a decisive snap, leaning back in his chair. Tonight he would set the wheels in motion. He had debated confronting Ellie directly, but this wasn't just about their marriage anymore. This was about exposing the truth, on his terms. His plan required precision. He picked up his phone and dialed Grace. "Grace, it's Weston. I need your help with something, and it's important." The dinner invitation was carefully worded, sent to Patrick and his wife under the guise of a friendly gathering. Ellie, unaware of Weston's intentions, had been hesitant at first. "A dinner party? With Patrick and Melissa?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral as she placed a stack of mail on the counter. "Why not?" Weston replied casually, his eyes never leaving hers. "We've all been so busy lately, it'll be nice to catch up." Ellie's hesitation lasted only a moment before she nodded. "Sure, sounds like a good idea." As the evening approached, Weston busied himself with preparations. The dining room was meticulously arranged, the table set with their best china. The air was charged with anticipation, each detail a part of the stage he had constructed. Ellie flitted around the house, her nervous energy palpable. "Do you need help with anything?" she asked, smoothing the front of her dress. "Just relax," Weston said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's under control." When the guests arrived, the atmosphere was cordial, almost festive. Patrick entered with Melissa, his arm draped casually over her shoulders, his charm on full display. Melissa greeted Ellie warmly, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Weston watched it all unfold with a calm exterior, but inside he was a coiled spring. The conversations flowed, laughter punctuating the clink of glasses, yet his focus never wavered. He bided his time, waiting for the perfect moment. As dinner wound down, Weston cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the chatter. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady. "It's been great catching up." Ellie's smile faltered as Weston's gaze settled on Patrick. "But there's something important I need to share. Something I think everyone here deserves to know." The room fell silent, all eyes on Weston. Ellie's hand tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles white. Patrick's easy smile wavered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Weston reached into his pocket and retrieved the envelope. He placed it on the table with deliberate care, his movements slow and measured. "Ellie," he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. "I found something recently, something that's been hard to process." Her eyes darted to the envelope, then back to his face. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, Weston slid the envelope toward her. "Open it," he said simply. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ellie picked up the envelope with trembling hands. She hesitated, her eyes pleading with Weston, but he remained unmoved. Finally, she opened it, the photographs spilling out onto the table. Melissa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the images. Patrick's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he avoided his wife's gaze. Ellie's breath hitched, her eyes wide with shock. "Weston," she began, her voice trembling, but he held up a hand to silence her. "This isn't just about us," Weston said, addressing the room now. "It's about the lies, the deceit, and the choices that have consequences." His gaze swept over Patrick and Ellie, his voice gaining strength. "I won't let this destroy me or my family." Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice shaking as she turned to Patrick. "How could you—" "Melissa, let me explain," Patrick started, but she cut him off. "Don't," she snapped, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, leaving Patrick frozen in place. Ellie sat motionless, the color drained from her face. "Weston, please," she whispered. "We can talk about this. Just give me a chance." But Weston shook his head, his voice cold and final. "No more lies, Ellie. This ends now." The dining room was heavy with silence, the kind that weighed down on shoulders and made every breath feel labored. Weston Callahan stood at the head of the table, his hands resting firmly on the back of his chair as his gaze moved deliberately around the room. Patrick Monroe shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while his wife Melissa's expression teetered between confusion and unease. Ellie sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the fabric of her dress. Weston cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the oppressive quiet. "First," he began, his voice steady, but with an edge that made everyone sit up straighter, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I know how busy life can be, and it means a lot that you took the time." Ellie's eyes darted nervously to Patrick, who gave her a brief, tight smile. Weston caught the exchange, the corners of his mouth pulling into a grim line. "But," he continued, "there's something important I need to address, something that's been weighing on me for some time." Melissa frowned, her fork hovering mid-air. "Weston, is everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. "No," Weston replied bluntly, his tone cold enough to make her flinch. "Everything is far from all right." Ellie inhaled sharply, her hands trembling as she reached for her glass of wine. "Weston," she began softly, "maybe we can—" He raised a hand, cutting her off. "Not now, Ellie." His eyes locked onto hers, holding her gaze until she looked away. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Reaching into his pocket, Weston pulled out the envelope, its edges worn from handling. He set it on the table with deliberate precision, the sound of it hitting the wood echoing in the stillness. "What I'm about to show you," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "might be difficult for some of you to see, but it's the truth, and the truth matters." Patrick's posture stiffened, his easygoing facade cracking for the first time. "Weston," he started, forcing a laugh that fell flat. "What is this? Some kind of dramatic gesture?" Weston's smile was cold, his eyes sharper than a blade. "You could call it that, or you could call it accountability." He slid the envelope across the table, stopping it in front of Ellie. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling as though touching it might burn her. "Open it," Weston instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. The room held its collective breath as Ellie peeled back the flap and pulled out the photographs. Her face drained of color as she flipped through them, each image a damning piece of evidence. Her laughter with Patrick at the cafe, his hand on her back, the two of them entering the inn. Melissa gasped, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she stood. "Patrick!" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of disbelief and fury. "What is this?" Patrick's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence spoke louder than any denial ever could. "Melissa," Ellie said weakly, her voice trembling, "I can explain." "Explain?" Melissa snapped, turning on her. "Explain what? That you've been sneaking around with my husband?" Patrick stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his mask of charm completely shattered. "Weston, you've made your point. Now let's sit down," Weston said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the force of a whip. Patrick hesitated, his jaw tightening, before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. Ellie's eyes brimmed with tears as she turned to Weston. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can we talk about this? Just the two of us?" Weston stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Talk?" he echoed. "Now you want to talk?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, even tone. "The time for talking ended the moment you decided to betray everything we built together." The weight of his words hung in the air as Melissa grabbed her coat, her voice trembling with anger. "We're done, Patrick," she said, her tone final. "Don't come home." As the front door slammed shut behind her, Weston straightened, his eyes never leaving Ellie. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "The rest is up to you." The echoes of the slammed door still reverberated through the house, leaving a vacuum of silence in its wake. Ellie sat at the dining table, her shoulders hunched, her face buried in her hands. Weston stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the dim light filtering through the curtains. His arms were crossed, his gaze fixed on the empty driveway where Melissa's car had peeled out moments before. "Weston, please!" Ellie's voice cracked, breaking the silence. "This isn't who I am, "Stop!" Weston interrupted, his tone icy. He turned to face her, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't recognize yourself in those photos. You made choices, Ellie, choices that destroyed everything we built." Her breath hitched, and she shook her head as tears spilled over her cheeks. "It wasn't like that. I wasn't thinking clearly. I weren't thinking clearly." Weston's voice rose, his calm veneer cracking for the first time. He took a step closer, his movements deliberate and sharp. "Do you think that makes it better? That somehow it erases what you did? What you've done to this family?" Ellie flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it could anchor her to reality. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "A terrible mistake, but I still love you." Weston let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and cutting. "Love? Do you even know what that word means? Because it doesn't look like sneaking around with another man. It doesn't look like lying to your husband or breaking your daughter's trust." At the mention of Charlotte, Ellie's head shot up, her expression stricken. "Charlotte! Does she know?" Weston's silence was her answer. Ellie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't. Weston, you can't let her hate me." "She deserves to know the truth," Weston said coldly. "She's not a child anymore, Ellie. She sees everything. Do you think she hasn't noticed how distant you've been? How broken this family is because of your selfishness?" Ellie's legs gave out and she sank back into her chair, her face pale. "I'll talk to her," she said, more to herself than to Weston. "I'll make her understand." "She already understands," Weston said sharply. "That's the problem." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her face a mix of anger and sorrow. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, a barrier against the storm raging in her heart. "Is it true?" Charlotte's voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Everything Dad showed me, the pictures, the texts. Is it true, Mom?" Ellie froze, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she whispered, "Charlotte, Yes or no?" Charlotte demanded, her voice rising. "Don't lie to me, not anymore." Ellie's shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "Yes," she choked out. "It's true." Charlotte let out a sharp breath, her arms dropping to her sides. The betrayal etched across her face was almost too much for Weston to bear, but he stood firm, his heart breaking for his daughter. "How could you?" Charlotte's voice cracked, her anger giving way to pain. "How could you do this to us? To Dad? Was it worth it?" Ellie reached out, but Charlotte stepped back, her eyes blazing with hurt. "Don't," she said firmly. "I don't want to hear excuses. I don't even know who you are anymore." With that, Charlotte turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Ellie sobbing at the table and Weston staring after her, his fists clenched at his sides. The sound of Charlotte's bedroom door slamming shut echoed through the house, a final punctuation to the evening's devastation. Weston looked back at Ellie, his expression devoid of sympathy. "This is what your choices have done," he said quietly. "Not just to me, but to her. And you're going to have to live with that." Ellie's sobs filled the silence as Weston turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to face the wreckage she had created. Weston Callahan leaned against the hood of his truck, the cold night air biting against his skin. The envelope in his hand felt heavier than its contents, a series of bank statements, legal documents, and a final nail in the coffin. Patrick's fraudulent schemes. He flipped through the papers again, his jaw tightening. Grace's words replayed in his mind. "Patrick has been doing this for years. My daughter wasn't the first, and Ellie won't be the last." The private investigator had delivered more than Weston had bargained for. Patrick's charm wasn't just a weapon in his personal life, it was his modus operandi. He preyed on people, used them, and discarded them when they were no longer useful. Now Weston had the proof. A text buzzed on his phone, pulling him from his thoughts. It was from Melissa, Patrick's estranged wife. "Let me know if you need anything else." He stared at the message for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before replying, "I will, thank you." Weston slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he drove home. His mind raced with possibilities. Confronting Ellie had been painful enough, but this was a war, and Patrick was the enemy. Weston had no intention of letting him escape unscathed. When he walked into the house, the tension was palpable. Ellie sat on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as he entered, her voice trembling. "Where have you been?" Weston ignored her question, tossing the envelope onto the coffee table. "Do you know who Patrick really is?" he asked, his tone cold and sharp. Ellie hesitated, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "Weston, Do you?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. Her silence was all the answer he needed. "He's a con artist," Weston continued, his words cutting like glass. "He's been scamming people for years, Ellie. Financial fraud, manipulation, destruction. And now, thanks to you, he's brought all of that into our lives." Ellie's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, Weston, I didn't know." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Weston shot back, his anger barely contained. "You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. You didn't care about what this would do to me, to Charlotte, to this family." Ellie reached for the envelope, her hands trembling as she flipped through the documents. The truth stared back at her in black and white. Patrick's offshore accounts, his history of lawsuits, the people he had left bankrupt. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What have I done?" Weston sat across from her, his gaze unrelenting. "You've let a predator into our lives, Ellie. And now we all have to pay the price." Ellie broke down, her sobs echoing through the room. Weston watched her for a moment before standing. "Save your tears," he said coldly. "They won't fix this." The next morning, Weston met with his lawyer. He laid out the evidence, not just of Ellie's affair, but of Patrick's illegal activities. "I want my assets protected," Weston said firmly, "and I want full custody of Charlotte." The lawyer nodded, flipping through the documents. "This is strong," he said. "We can use this to ensure she has no claim to your business or finances. As for custody, this will certainly help your case." Later that afternoon, Weston sat down with Charlotte. She had been quiet since the confrontation, retreating into herself. "Sweetheart," Weston said gently, "I need to talk to you about what's happening." Charlotte looked up, her eyes wary. "Are you leaving Mom?" "Yes," Weston said softly but firmly. "But this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." Tears welled up in Charlotte's eyes, and she threw her arms around him. "I hate her," she whispered. "I hate what she's done." Weston held her tightly, his own tears threatening to spill. "I know," he said, "but we're going to get through this, together." As the evening wore on, Weston prepared for the next step. He had one more move to make, and it involved ensuring Patrick couldn't harm anyone else. The web Patrick had spun was unraveling, and Weston intended to pull every thread until there was nothing left. The suitcase sat by the front door, its presence heavy with finality. Weston Callahan stood in the entryway, his hand resting on the handle. The weight of the past weeks bore down on him, but his expression was resolute. Behind him, Charlotte lingered near the staircase, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was set, her eyes fixed on the woman sitting on the couch. Ellie sat frozen, her hands clasped together in her lap as she stared at the floor. Her eyes were swollen, her cheeks streaked with dried tears, but no words escaped her lips. The silence between them was deafening, filled with everything they couldn't say. "This is it, Ellie," Weston said quietly, his voice devoid of anger but full of resolve. "I can't stay here anymore, not after everything." Ellie looked up, her eyes searching his for a trace of the man who had once loved her. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't do this. Don't leave. We can fix this. We can fix us." Weston shook his head slowly, the sadness in his eyes cutting through her like a blade. "There's no fixing this," he said. "What you broke, it's beyond repair." Tears spilled down Ellie's face as she stood, her hands trembling. "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "But I love you, Weston. I love our family. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Love?" Weston echoed, his tone sharp. "You don't betray the people you love. You don't lie to them. You don't destroy them." Ellie took a step closer, her voice desperate. "I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. But I know now, Weston. I know what I've done, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Weston held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "It's too late," he said firmly. "You didn't just hurt me, Ellie. You hurt Charlotte. You shattered her trust, and that's something I can't forgive." At the mention of her daughter, Ellie turned to Charlotte, her expression pleading. "Charlotte, please," she begged. "I know I've hurt you, but I love you. You're my daughter. Please don't hate me." Charlotte's face hardened, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You didn't think about me when you were sneaking around with Patrick," she said coldly. "You didn't think about how it would feel to watch our family fall apart. So don't stand there and act like you care now." Ellie's knees buckled and she sank onto the couch, her sobs racking her body. Weston turned to Charlotte, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said softly. Charlotte nodded, her face set with determination as she followed her father to the door. Weston paused, his hand on the doorknob, and glanced back at Ellie one last time. "I hope you find a way to live with this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Because I don't think I ever will." The door closed behind them with a quiet click, leaving Ellie alone in the silence of the empty house. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a vice. The memories of what she had lost played in her mind, a montage of laughter, love, and the family she had destroyed with her own choices. Outside, Weston loaded the suitcase into the truck as Charlotte climbed into the passenger seat. As he started the engine, he glanced at her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Charlotte looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think I will be, someday." Weston nodded, his grip on the wheel tightening. "We'll get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll find a way." As the truck pulled away from the house, the faint glow of the porch light grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The house felt impossibly quiet. Ellie sat in the living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. The once bustling home, filled with laughter and the familiar sounds of family life, now echoed with a hollow emptiness. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her of what she had lost. Her gaze fell on the family photo perched on the mantel, a frozen moment of happiness. Weston's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his smile warm and genuine. Charlotte stood between them, her face bright with youthful joy. Ellie reached out, her fingers brushing the frame, and then stopped. The photo didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like a relic from a life she no longer belonged to. The silence was broken by the hum of her phone on the coffee table. Ellie hesitated, her heart sinking as she read the name flashing on the screen. Patrick. She let it buzz until it stopped, her chest tightening as she thought of the man who had seemed like an escape from her reality, a fleeting thrill that had cost her everything. A knock on the door startled her. She rose slowly, her movements lethargic, and opened it to find Grace Monroe standing on the porch. Grace's expression was a mixture of pity and frustration, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Ellie," Grace began, her tone firm but not unkind. "May I come in?" Ellie stepped aside, her head hanging low. Grace walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the space that seemed so much larger now. She took a seat on the couch, motioning for Ellie to join her. "What are you doing, Ellie?" Grace asked bluntly. "I've seen people make mistakes before, but you've let this mistake consume everything." Ellie's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Grace continued, her voice softening. "You've lost Weston. You've lost Charlotte. And from the looks of it, Patrick's not sticking around either. So what's your plan now?" Ellie shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know. I don't know how to fix any of this." "Fix?" Grace scoffed, leaning forward. "Ellie, there's no fixing what you've done. You can't undo this. All you can do is decide what kind of person you want to be from here on out." Ellie wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I love them," she whispered. "I love Weston. I love Charlotte. I don't know why I did what I did." Grace sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Maybe it's time to stop thinking about what you've lost and start thinking about what you can salvage. Charlotte's hurt, but she's not gone. She's still your daughter. Maybe start there." Ellie nodded weakly, the weight of Grace's words settling over her. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know, Ellie. That's up to her. But forgiveness isn't something you can ask for. It's something you earn." The conversation left Ellie feeling raw and exposed, but there was a flicker of determination beneath the pain. As Grace left, Ellie stood in the doorway, watching her retreat down the path. For the first time in days, she felt a faint glimmer of purpose. Later that evening, Ellie sat down to write a letter. Her hand trembled as she penned the words, each one a plea for understanding, an acknowledgement of her failures, and a desperate hope for redemption. She addressed it to Charlotte, folding the paper carefully before tucking it into an envelope. She left it on the kitchen table, knowing it might be ignored, knowing it might never be enough. But it was all she had left to give. As the night deepened, Ellie wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She paused in Charlotte's room, the bed neatly made, the shelves lined with books and trinkets from happier times. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the edge tightly as she whispered into the void, "I'm so sorry. For everything." The house offered no reply, only the weight of its silence. Weston Callahan stood at the edge of the park, the cool breeze tugging at his jacket. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the playground, where children's laughter rang out. Charlotte sat on a nearby bench, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her usual spark was missing, replaced by a quiet sadness that Weston couldn't ignore. He approached slowly, his steps careful. "Hey," he said softly, taking a seat beside her. Charlotte glanced at him, offering a faint smile. "Hey." For a moment they sat in silence, the world around them moving as if in slow motion. Weston's hands rested on his knees, his fingers tapping lightly as he searched for the right words. "You know," he began, his voice low, "when I was your age, I thought my parents had all the answers. I thought they could do no wrong. Charlotte's gaze dropped to her hands, which fidgeted with the hem of her jacket. "And then you grew up?" Weston chuckled lightly, though the sound held no real humor. "Yeah, and I realized they were just people. People who made mistakes." Charlotte looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You think I should forgive her, don't you?" Weston exhaled, leaning back against the bench. "I think forgiveness is complicated," he admitted. "It's not something you do for the other person. It's something you do for yourself. To let go of the anger, the hurt." Charlotte frowned, her brow furrowing. "I don't know if I can." "And that's okay," Weston said gently. "You don't have to do it right now, or ever if you're not ready. But just remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean what she did was okay. It just means you're not letting it control you anymore." Charlotte nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Did you forgive her?" Weston hesitated, the question hanging in the air. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I've decided to move on. And sometimes that's the best you can do." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park. Weston reached over, placing a comforting hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we've got each other." Charlotte leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder. "Thanks, Dad." As the sky darkened, Weston's thoughts drifted to Ellie. He wondered what she was doing, how she was coping with the emptiness of the house. Despite everything, a part of him still felt the ache of loss, the ghost of the life they once had. Back at the house, Ellie sat at the dining table, a single candle flickering beside her. The letter she had written to Charlotte remained untouched. She stared at the envelope, her fingers tracing the edges, but she couldn't bring herself to move it. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her, heavier than ever. She rose slowly, her steps carrying her to the bookshelf Weston had built for her all those years ago. Her fingers brushed the spines of the books, pausing on the one he had inscribed for her. "To Ellie, my heart and my home." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, clutching the book to her chest. The memories came rushing back, his laughter, Charlotte's giggles, the warmth of their family, and then the cold reality of her choices, the consequences she could never escape. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the silence, her tears soaking the cover of the book. "I'm so sorry." But the house, like her life, offered no reply. Weston Callahan stood in the middle of his new living room, the faint smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. Boxes surrounded him, some half open, revealing pieces of a life he was slowly trying to rebuild. Charlotte moved past him, carrying a smaller box labeled Books to her room. She had been quieter than usual, but her presence carried a sense of strength that Weston hadn't seen in weeks. "Need help with that?" Weston asked, his voice light as he followed her to the doorway. Charlotte shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've got it." Weston leaned against the frame, watching as she carefully unpacked. Her books were lined up neatly on the shelf, trinkets finding their places among the titles. It was a small act of normalcy, but it filled the space with warmth. "You're doing a good job," he said softly. Charlotte glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thanks, Dad." Downstairs, Weston's phone buzzed on the counter. He hesitated before picking it up, his chest tightening at the name on the screen. Ellie. The calls had become less frequent, but each one felt like reopening an old wound. With a sigh, he let it go to voicemail and returned to unpacking. The new house wasn't large, but it was theirs. The furniture was modest, the walls bare, but it was a place to start over, a place where the past didn't loom quite so heavily. Weston unpacked the last box in the kitchen, pausing when he pulled out a familiar ceramic mug. It was one of Ellie's favorites, a memento from a long-ago trip to the mountains. He turned it over in his hands before setting it aside, out of sight. Later that evening, Charlotte joined him in the living room, her legs curled beneath her on the couch. They watched an old movie together, the kind they used to enjoy as a family. The quiet companionship was comforting, but Weston couldn't help but feel the weight of what was missing. Still, he knew this was the first step forward. "Do you think she's okay?" Charlotte asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Weston turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Your mom?" Charlotte nodded, her gaze fixed on the screen. I'm still mad at her, but I don't hate her, not really. Weston took a deep breath, his hand resting on the arm of the couch. She's trying, he said carefully. I know she's struggling, but it's not our job to fix her, Charlotte. She has to figure that out for herself. Charlotte nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Do you think she'll ever be the same? I don't know, Weston admitted, but I think she'll find her way. We all will. The following morning, Weston dropped Charlotte off at school, her goodbye a little brighter than it had been in weeks. As he drove back home, he stopped at a small cafe he hadn't visited in years. Sitting at a corner table, he sipped his coffee, letting the quiet moments settle over him. His thoughts drifted to Ellie. He imagined her in their old house, surrounded by the remnants of their life together. He hoped she would find a way to heal, to rebuild, but he knew their paths had diverged. Their chapter had closed. Weston glanced at his watch, standing and heading to the door. As he stepped out into the crisp morning air, he felt a small, unfamiliar sense of peace. Moving on didn't mean forgetting, it meant accepting, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Weston and Charlotte sat on the porch, sharing stories and laughter. The glow of the streetlights illuminated their faces, and for a brief moment, the world felt whole again. Ellie sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet house. The table in front of her was scattered with remnants of her past, a wedding photo, a small drawing Charlotte had made years ago, and the book Weston had once inscribed for her. She traced her fingers over the words on the inside cover, her heart aching with the weight of what she had lost. Her reflection in the darkened window stared back at her, hollow and unrecognizable. She had spent weeks replaying her choices, dissecting every moment that had led her to this place. The house was empty, yet it felt crowded with memories, ones that now felt more like ghosts. She reached for the letter she had written to Charlotte, still unopened on the table. Ellie's hands trembled as she unfolded it, reading the words she had poured her soul into. Each sentence was a plea, a confession, a desperate hope for understanding. But deep down, she knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not erase the damage she had done. The faint buzz of her phone startled her. It was a message from Patrick, a brief, impersonal apology followed by silence. She stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. The man she had risked everything for had disappeared, leaving her to face the wreckage alone. She deleted the message without replying, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, Weston stood on the porch of his new home, the cool night air filling his lungs. The laughter from inside warmed his heart. Charlotte was on the phone with a friend, her voice light and carefree in a way he hadn't heard in months. He smiled to himself, grateful for the resilience she had shown. As the stars emerged, Weston reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His pain had been immeasurable, but so too had been his growth. The betrayal had taught him the value of boundaries, of self-respect, and of choosing peace over chaos. He had lost the family he thought he knew, but in its place he had forged a new bond with Charlotte, one built on honesty and strength. Ellie's face flashed in his mind. He wondered if she was okay, if she had found a way to reconcile with the person she had become. Despite everything, a small part of him hoped she would find her way. But he also knew it wasn't his responsibility anymore. Their story had ended, and he had to let go. Back in the old house, Ellie wandered into Charlotte's room. The space felt untouched, frozen in time. She sat on the bed, clutching the stuffed animal Charlotte had once adored. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered into the emptiness, "I'm sorry, baby. I hope you'll find a way to forgive me someday." The next morning, Ellie gathered her courage and left the house for the first time in days. She walked to the park where she and Weston had once brought Charlotte as a toddler. The sight of children playing brought a bittersweet smile to her face. She sat on a bench, watching as life moved on around her. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ellie?" It was Grace, her expression a mixture of surprise and sympathy. Ellie managed a small smile. "Hi, Grace." The two women talked for hours, Ellie pouring out her regrets, her fears, and her hopes. Grace listened patiently, offering neither judgment nor absolution. "It's not about what you've lost," Grace said softly. "It's about what you do with what's left." As the day turned to evening, Ellie walked home, Grace's words echoing in her mind. She stood at the threshold of the house, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. The walls still held the shadows of her mistakes, but for the first time she felt the faintest spark of determination. She couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could build a future worth living for. And as Weston and Charlotte sat together that night, their laughter filling their new home, they too began to find peace. The past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined their lives. They had learned in the hardest of ways that sometimes the only way forward is to let go.